You can't read any 2 pages of the Bible, Old Testament or New, without coming across the wrath of God.
Okay, so you said you made reference to Jesus's exchanges with the Pharisees.
Mhm.
I'm reading Matthew right now. I'm really struck this time by the intensity of his rage at the Pharisees.
Often when we think of Jesus, we think of his peacefulness, right? The Prince of Peace. This season, we see another side of him, though. We see what I'd like to call righteous anger. Can you talk about what brings him to that place?
I think you have to ask yourself, well, why is he mad?
Yeah.
And what is he mad about? And who are the Pharisees to him?
Hey everyone, I hope that got you thinking. I want us to be thinking about the attribute of Jesus that often goes overlooked, if not completely forgotten and reinterpreted by our culture these days. That is the idea of Jesus' righteous anger. Now, as you saw, whenever Jonathan Rumi goes on a talk show, he's met with this question. I believe this is the case because people don't understand how God could be angry. He's just an all loving God, so how could he be angry? Now, as we see from scripture, Jesus clearly does get angry. The question that is so important is why is he getting angry? And to answer that question, we're going to look at 2 clips. The first is this conversation between Rumi and Tucker Carlson, as you saw in the intro. And then we are going to zoom out and look at this idea from a broader biblical perspective with Bishop Barron. Bishop Barron's interpretation of God's wrath really illuminates how we should think about Jesus in the temple that day. Let's go.
And I think it goes back to what I was referencing, in that here you have who are people that are supposed to be models of God's law and rule and grace. The Pharisees, like the priests, the people that the people look up to for spiritual advice and wisdom and guidance. And because Jesus can read souls and know what's in their hearts, he sees they're probably the worst of them. And he knows that they have ill will towards him, and they don't have the interests of the people in their hearts because they're so enraptured by the letters of the law. As he said, you're so concerned about the letter of the law that you're not even considered about the heart of the law, which is, God's mercy and justice. And how are these people? How are you treating these people? I mean, the fact that they would go every year on Passover, the poorest of the poor, trying to bring their offerings and sacrifices, that through extortion were getting charged 500%, probably more than what they should have. I don't know the exact numbers, but the point was that they were being extorted every step of the way.
So, what truly made Jesus angry, I want us to look at 2 things. Firstly, it was the failure of the religious leaders to teach the true intent of the law. The Pharisees were truncating the law into a list of dues in order to make oneself right with God. And because they were sinners, they seized this opportunity to make a great profit at the expense of the people and ultimately at the expense of right worship rendered back to Yahweh. Jesus gets really mad that God's holy temple has been turned into a secular marketplace, and that's the first thing to see. A secular marketplace with corrupt religious leaders using it as an opportunity, using God's great name, using God's great law as an opportunity to get wealthy at the expense of the poor. Secondly, what really makes Jesus mad, though, if you're kind of zooming out and thinking about this theologically, probably actually rather zooming in and getting really, really in on the point, is that what makes Jesus mad is sin. I think he's in the temple aware of just the depravity of the situation, of what's really going on. While everybody else thinks they're doing exactly what God would want them to do, Jesus realizes that it's all sin. It's all missing the mark of what God originally intended. He knows that all of those sacrifices cannot deal with the root issue of what's going on. So much in the same way that he cries at Lazarus' tomb because of death and because of sin, Here, I think he's getting enraged at the only thing that truly ever makes God mad in the first place, truly makes God want to intervene and produce just wrath, and that is sin. All right, so let's shift scenes. The picture of Jesus in the temple is really just a microcosm of what's really going on in the entire Bible at the macro level. Bishop Barron has a unique take on this and what God's anger is all about. Check this out.
You can't read any 2 pages of the Bible, Old Testament or New, without coming across the wrath of God, it seems to me. To say that, oh, it's all sequestered in these weird old texts of the Old Testament, nonsense. It runs right through the Bible. Because we have this weird, capricious God. Wasn't it Richard Dawkins said, God is like King Lear in Act 5, who's raging, and except that King Lear is less insane. That was Richard Dawkins. That's how not to read the Bible. We're not talking about that. When we mention when the Bible mentions the wrath of God, what is it? God doesn't fall in and out of snits, doesn't fall in and out of emotional states. Read Aquinas on that. God is love. That's all God knows how to do. That's all God is, right through. That's all God is. That's all God can do is love. When Aquinas says, for example, can God sin? And the answer is no. That's a very important intuition. What do you mean you can't sin? I can sin. So isn't God's freedom greater than mine? And Aquinas says, no, of course God can't sin. God can't be at odds with his own nature. So don't think of this as, oh, God has become wrathful and, oh my goodness, his mind has changed and now he's trying to... No. The wrath of God, think of it this way. God's passion to set things right. Right? If God is love, that means willing the good of the other. What does God hate? He hates sin. He hates dysfunction. He hates what's happened to us. And he has a passion, if I can use that metaphorical language, he has a passion to set it right. That's God's anger. That's God's wrath. You see how it comes again? I keep pointing to a climax there. When we speak of God pouring out his wrath on sin. Yes, that's right. And so this thing about God's desire to wipe out the human race, it's God's passion to set things right. So what does he do? He sends a rescue operation.
So to conclude, what Bishop Barron is providing us with is a great visual of how to think about the wrath of God. You see, God's wrath is not a capricious act of changing his mind, because God doesn't change his mind. God doesn't really have emotions that makes him enact capriciously, but it flows out of his good will of love, of which he actually is towards men to set things right. So, to use Bishop Barron's phrase, it's a rescue operation. Anytime you see the wrath of God, it really is his divine intervention to rescue the whole project. And we see that from Noah's Ark. So, when you have that theological framework in mind, that leads to a very interesting interpretation of what Jesus did in the temple that day. What Jesus was doing through wrath, through divine intervention, is something like a rescue operation. So, God's righteous anger and wrath is really a manifestation of God's goodwill towards humanity. So, God's wrath and love are not at odds with one another. Jesus was clearing out the temple in a great miraculous act of right ordering. Okay. Remember Jesus calming the wind and the waves and bringing everything to rest? That is what Jesus is doing in the temple that day. He is bringing everything back to its original intention and function. He's actually producing harmony and shalom by driving all of the sin and corruption out. He moves in righteous anger and justice so that there can be this harmony. There can be the presence of God in right order of how God would want to be worshiped. It's love tethered to divine justice and intervention, and that's a rescue operation. So, does Jesus get angry? Yes. But that anger is always tethered towards the good of humanity, towards the willing of what God would want. So in other words, it's loving. The righteous anger of God, the wrath of God, is not at odds with the goodwill and benevolence that he has for his creation. The only thing God ever gets mad at is the domain of death and sin that have ravished our world. And luckily, he gets angry, so he brings about his divine intervention and provides a rescue operation. All right, that's all I have for this clip. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Remember that Christianity is Christ, and without him, there is no Christianity. And I'll see you in the next one. Peace.